The piercing autumn wind carried Rose Grayson's sobs across the barren Kansas prairie as she clutched her swollen belly, staggering away from the only home she'd known for 22 years. Independence, Missouri faded behind her as darkness descended on the frontier town that had just cast her out like yesterday's trash. The year was 1876, and an unmarried woman carrying a child was deemed unfit for decent society, especially the daughter of a preacher who had built his reputation on moral righteousness. "Don't you ever show your face in this town again," her father's final words echoed in her mind, cutting deeper than the cold that penetrated her thin shawl. His face, contorted with disgust and shame, had been the last sight before the door slammed in her face. She'd been walking for hours, her small bundle of possessions growing heavier with each step, her boots caked with mud from the recent rainfall. The baby kicked, as if protesting the harsh treatment they were both enduring. 3 more months, until the child would come into this world, 3 months to find shelter, safety, and some semblance of a future. The distant flicker of a lantern pierced the growing darkness. Rose hesitated, her breath forming small clouds in the chill air. The sensible part of her warned against approaching an unknown homestead after nightfall, but the maternal instinct to protect her unborn child pushed her forward. 1 foot in front of the other, she trudged toward the light. As she drew closer, the outline of a modest cabin emerged. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, promising warmth that made her ache with longing. A barn stood nearby, and the soft nickering of horses carried on the wind. Rose paused at the edge of the cleared land, summoning what little courage remained. She was about to call out when her foot caught on a hidden root. Rose tumbled forward, a cry escaping her lips as she fell hard onto her knees, her hands instinctively protecting her belly. The bundle of her possessions scattered across the ground. The cabin door swung open, spilling golden lamplight across the yard. A tall figure emerged, rifle in hand. "Who's out there?" The man's voice was deep but not threatening. "Show yourself, please," Rose managed, her voice breaking. "I mean no harm." The figure moved closer, lantern raised. In its light, Rose could see a man perhaps a few years older than herself, lean and weathered, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes that seemed to absorb the shadows around them. His dark hair fell in waves nearly to his shoulders, and a week's worth of beard covered his jawline. "Madam." His expression shifted from wariness to concern as he took in her condition. "Are you hurt?" Rose tried to stand but swayed dangerously. Exhaustion, hunger, and despair had taken their toll. "My baby." The rifle was instantly set aside as he crossed the remaining distance between them. "Easy now," he said, steadying her with gentle hands. His eyes widened as he noticed her rounded belly. "I just need to rest," she whispered. "Just for tonight, I'll be gone by morning." The man studied her face for a long moment, then glanced back at his cabin. Without another word, he gathered her scattered belongings and offered his arm for support. "Come inside," he said simply. "It's no night for anyone to be wandering, least of all someone in your condition." Rose hesitated, remembering all the warnings about strange men and isolated cabins. But the alternative was the cold, unforgiving night, and her child deserved better. "Thank you," she murmured, accepting his help. "Preston," he said as he guided her toward the warmth of the cabin. "Preston Ellis." "Rose Grayson," she replied, her voice barely audible above the wind. Inside, the cabin was modest but meticulously maintained. A fire crackled in the hearth, illuminating simple furniture: a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the fire, a narrow bed in one corner with a patchwork quilt. Shelves lined with books suggested a man of more education than the average frontier settler. "Sit," Preston said, indicating the rocking chair. "I'll make some tea." Rose sank gratefully into the chair, feeling the tension in her body begin to ease in the blessed warmth. She watched as Preston moved with efficient grace around his small kitchen area, setting a kettle to boil and slicing bread from a loaf on the counter. "When was the last time you ate, Miss Grayson?" he asked without looking at her. "This morning," she admitted, "though not much." He nodded, adding cheese and some dried apple slices to the plate. "This isn't much of a meal, but it'll do until morning." When he handed her the plate, their fingers brushed momentarily. Rose felt an unexpected jolt of awareness, quickly pushed aside by her ravenous hunger. She ate with as much dignity as she could muster, though it took considerable restraint not to devour everything in seconds. "How far along are you?" Preston asked as he poured the tea. "6 months," Rose answered, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. "A bit more, perhaps." He nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his features. "And you're traveling alone?" Rose tensed, the food suddenly tasteless in her mouth. "Yes," Preston seemed to sense her discomfort. "You don't owe me explanations, Miss Grayson. But it's not safe for a woman in your condition to be wandering these parts without protection." "I didn't have much choice in the matter," she replied, her voice hardening slightly. He nodded again, accepting her answer without pressing. "You're welcome to stay the night. I've got blankets to make a pallet by the fire. In the morning we can figure out your next steps." "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose further. If you could just point me toward the nearest town tomorrow." "The nearest town is a good 2 days' ride," Preston interrupted gently. "And that's on horseback, not on foot. Independence is the closest settlement, and that's no—" The word burst from her with unexpected force. "I can't go back there." Preston raised an eyebrow but nodded slowly. "All right, not Independence then." He studied her for a moment. "Look, Miss Grayson, I don't know your situation, and it's not my place to ask. But you're in no condition to be traveling alone, especially with winter coming on. I've got the space here and work that needs doing that you might be able to help with, at least until." He gestured vaguely toward her belly, a hint of color rising in his cheeks. Rose stared at him, trying to discern his intentions. She'd learned the hard way that men rarely offered assistance without expecting something in return. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." Preston ran a hand through his hair, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "My mother was in a situation not unlike yours once. Someone helped her when no one else would." His eyes met hers directly. "I believe in returning kindnesses when the opportunity presents itself." There was something in his steady gaze that convinced Rose he was speaking the truth. Still, caution held her tongue. "You can think about it overnight," Preston said when she didn't respond. "No need to decide right now. You're safe here regardless." Those words, "you're safe here," nearly undid her. Rose blinked back sudden tears, nodding because she couldn't trust her voice. Preston cleared away the dishes, then brought out extra blankets and a pillow, making a comfortable pallet near the hearth. "I'll be just outside in the lean-to for tonight," he said. "More room for you in here." "You don't have to leave your own home," Rose protested. "It's no trouble. I sleep out there sometimes anyway when I'm working late with the horses." He moved toward the door. "There's water in the pitcher if you need it. Rest well, Miss Grayson." After he'd gone, Rose sat in the rocking chair for a long time, staring into the flames and weighing her options. In truth, she had nowhere to go, no family who would take her in, no friends brave enough to defy the judgment of Independence's righteous citizens. The father of her child was long gone, a charming drifter who'd promised marriage and a new life in California, only to disappear after getting what he wanted. Her hand caressed her belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her touch. "We'll be all right," she whispered. Somehow. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her. Rose sank onto the pallet, grateful for the softness and warmth after the long, terrible day. As sleep overtook her, she tried not to think about tomorrow, or the day after, or the day her child would enter this uncertain world. Morning light filtered through the cabin's small windows, rousing Rose from the deepest sleep she'd had in weeks. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. This wasn't her room in her father's house. Then the events of the previous day crashed back, and she curled around her swollen belly, a wave of despair threatening to overwhelm her. The cabin door opened, and Preston entered carrying an armload of firewood. He stopped when he saw she was awake, offering a small smile. "Good morning," he said, moving to stack the wood near the hearth. "Did you sleep all right?" Rose sat up, hastily smoothing her hair. "Yes, thank you, better than I expected." "Good." He busied himself with rebuilding the fire. "I've already seen to the livestock. Thought you might want something to eat before you decide what you're doing next." Rose watched him work, noting the careful efficiency of his movements. In the morning light, she could see him more clearly. He was handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and those unusual eyes that seemed to shift between gray and green depending on the light. He appeared to be in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most. "Mr. Ellis," she began hesitantly, "your offer from last night." He glanced up. It stands. You're welcome to stay here at least until your child comes. I've got the room, and as I said, there's work that could use an extra pair of hands." "What sort of work?" Rose asked, pulling herself to her feet. "I'm not afraid of hard labor, though I admit my condition limits me somewhat," Preston nodded. "I breed and train horses. The physical work I handle myself, but I could use help with the accounts, correspondence, and keeping things organized. My handwriting is terrible, and I'm months behind on my record keeping." He gestured toward a desk in the corner, piled with papers. "I'm good with numbers," Rose said, "and my penmanship was always praised at school. Then we might have an arrangement that benefits us both." Preston stood, dusting off his hands. "You can have the cabin. I've been meaning to move into the rooms above the stable anyway, now that I've finished building them out." Rose shook her head. "I couldn't put you out of your home. You wouldn't be. The stable rooms are more convenient for my work." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Miss Grayson, I understand your caution. A woman alone has to be wary, especially out here. All I'm offering is safe harbor and honest work. Nothing more is expected." Rose studied him, sensing no deception in his straightforward gaze. Her options were severely limited, and winter on the plains was no time to be wandering homeless and pregnant. "Very well," she said finally. "I accept your offer, Mr. Ellis, until the baby comes. After that, we'll see." Relief flickered across his features. "Good, that's settled then." He moved toward the door. "I'll bring in some eggs for breakfast. Take your time getting up." After he left, Rose allowed herself a moment of relief. She had shelter, at least temporarily. The worry of where she would deliver her child had been postponed, if not resolved. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was better than she had dared to hope for when her father had cast her out. Over breakfast, they negotiated the details of their arrangement. Preston would provide room and board, plus a small wage for Rose's work with his business accounts and correspondence. Rose would have the cabin to herself, while Preston would move to his rooms above the stable. "I should tell you," Preston said as they finished their meal, "I ride into town every couple of weeks for supplies and mail. I can bring back whatever you need, but if you're avoiding independence." "I am," Rose confirmed. "My father is Reverend Grayson at the First Church. He made it clear I'm not welcome there anymore." Understanding dawned in Preston's eyes. "I see." He didn't ask for more details, which Rose appreciated. "Well, there's Westport and Kansas City a bit further out. I make trips there occasionally for larger supplies." "Thank you," Rose hesitated. "Mr. Ellis, I should warn you, if people learn you're harboring me, it could affect your business dealings. My father has considerable influence." Preston's expression hardened slightly. "No offense to your father, Miss Grayson, but I make my own judgments about people. My business is with the horses, not the church." Rose nodded, grateful for his stance but still worried. "All the same, discretion might be wise." "Agreed." Preston stood. "Would you like to see the rest of the place? It's not grand, but it's home." The tour revealed Preston's operation to be more substantial than Rose had initially thought. Beyond the cabin and main stable was a smaller paddock for new mothers and foals, a training ring, and several fenced pastures where horses of various ages grazed in the autumn sunshine. A workshop attached to the stable housed leather-working tools and tack. "I specialize in quarter horses," Preston explained as they walked, maintaining a respectful distance between them. "Good for ranch work, reliable and smart. I've been building a reputation for quality stock these past 5 years." "Have you always worked with horses?" Rose asked, genuinely curious. A shadow passed over his face. "No, I was studying to be a doctor back east before the war." "The war?" She looked at him with surprise, mentally calculating. "You seem too young to have fought." "I was 17 when I enlisted in '64, he said quietly. "Old enough to carry a rifle, too young to know better." Rose sensed there was more to the story, but Preston had respected her privacy, and she would do the same for him. "So from medicine to horses, that's quite a change, in some ways." His expression lightened. "Both require patience, careful observation, and steady hands." He stopped at the fence of the training ring where a beautiful sorrel mare trotted in elegant circles. "That's Ember, my best broodmare." "She's magnificent," Rose said sincerely, watching the horse's graceful movements. "She's also stubborn, temperamental, and particular about who she allows near her." There was unmistakable affection in his voice, but worth every bit of trouble. They watched the mare in comfortable silence for a few moments before Preston spoke again. "If you're feeling up to it, I could show you the account books this afternoon. No rush, though, you should rest today." "I'd like to make myself useful as soon as possible," Rose insisted. "Idle hands were never tolerated in my father's house." Something like admiration flickered in Preston's eyes. "As you wish, but don't overtax yourself on my account." The days settled into a steady rhythm. Rose took over Preston's neglected paperwork, bringing order to his chaotic record-keeping system. She discovered he had a thriving business that was larger than he'd let on. Clients from as far as St. Louis and Omaha sought his horses, and his reputation for fair dealing and quality stock was growing. Preston, true to his word, kept a respectful distance, moving his belongings to the rooms above the stable the very first day. They shared meals together, usually breakfast and dinner, during which their conversation gradually became more comfortable. He never pressed her for details about her circumstances, and Rose found herself growing to trust his quiet strength and unfailing courtesy. October gave way to November, bringing the first real chill of winter. Rose's belly grew larger, the baby more active. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings when she sat before the fire, she would feel a flutter of panic about the approaching birth. She had basic knowledge of the process, but had never attended a delivery herself. The nearest midwife was in Independence impossible to call upon given her situation. One evening, as an early snowfall blanketed the farm, Preston returned from checking the animals with a serious expression. "Storm's coming," he said, stamping snow from his boots before entering the cabin. "A big one from the look of the sky. I've prepared the stable, but we should make sure you have enough supplies in case I can't get back to the cabin for a day or two." Rose nodded, already mentally cataloging what they might need. "I'll make extra bread tomorrow. There's plenty of firewood stacked by the door." "Good." Preston hesitated. "Miss Grayson, Rose, there's something else we should discuss, though it's delicate." The use of her first name, a rare occurrence despite their weeks together, alerted her to the seriousness of whatever he wanted to say. "What is it, your condition?" His eyes briefly dropped to her belly before returning to her face. "You're what, 7 months along now, nearly 8, she corrected softly. "Right." Preston ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. "I've been thinking about when the time comes. The nearest doctor is in Independence, and even in good weather that's not an option," Rose finished firmly. "I told you before." "I know." He took a deep breath. "What I'm trying to say is I have some medical training. It's been years, and I never completed my studies, but I helped deliver babies during the war when medical staff was short." His expression grew somber. "I'm not a midwife or a doctor, but I know the basics. If you're willing, I could assist when the time comes." Rose felt her cheeks flush at the impropriety of what he was suggesting, yet the practicality was undeniable. "Mr. Ellis, that's inappropriate, I know," he interrupted. "But out here, sometimes propriety has to give way to necessity. I wouldn't offer if I didn't think it might be needed." Rose swallowed hard, considering. The thought of facing childbirth alone was terrifying. Having someone with even limited knowledge would be better than nothing. And over these weeks, she'd come to trust Preston's integrity. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "Thank you for offering." He nodded, seeming relieved she hadn't outright refused. "That's all I ask, now, about those supplies." The predicted storm arrived with a vengeance the following day, howling winds driving snow against the cabin windows. Rose kept the fire well stoked and busied herself with baking and mending, trying not to worry about Preston out in the stables, ensuring the animals were protected from the bitter cold. By evening, the storm had intensified. Rose peered anxiously out the window, barely able to see the stable through the whirling snow. When the cabin door finally opened, admitting a blast of frigid air and a snow-covered Preston, she couldn't suppress her sigh of relief. "The animals are secure," he reported, shedding his ice-crusted coat. "I've brought some extra supplies from my quarters if that's all right. I think it's best if I stay here tonight. This storm is worse than I expected." "Of course," Rose said, already pouring a cup of hot coffee for him. "You'll freeze trying to get back to the stable." Preston accepted the coffee gratefully, his hands red and chapped from the cold. "I'll make a pallet by the door. I don't want to intrude on your space." "Don't be ridiculous." Rose replied more sharply than she'd intended. It's freezing by the door. The fire's the warmest spot. He looked at her in surprise, then nodded. If you're sure. They ate a simple dinner of stew and bread, the howling wind making conversation difficult. Afterward, Preston helped her clear the dishes, then set about making his sleeping place near the hearth, a respectable distance from where Rose's bed now stood in the corner. As Rose prepared for sleep behind a privacy screen Preston had constructed for her weeks ago, she felt an odd mixture of comfort and nervousness at his presence. It was the first time since her arrival that they had shared the cabin overnight. Yet after the initial awkwardness, there was something reassuring about not being alone during the violent storm. She emerged in her nightgown and robe, her hair braided for sleep, to find Preston already settled on his pallet, staring into the fire. He glanced up briefly, then politely averted his eyes. "Good night, Mr. Ellis," she said softly, climbing into her bed. "Good night, Miss Grayson," he replied. "Sleep well." Despite the storm's fury, Rose found herself drifting off quickly, lulled by the fire's warmth and the strange security of another person's presence. She woke sometime in the night, momentarily disoriented, to find the cabin in darkness except for the dying embers in the fireplace. As her eyes adjusted, she made out Preston's form silhouetted against the faint glow as he carefully added wood to the fire. His movements were gentle, clearly trying not to wake her. Something about his consideration in this small act moved her unexpectedly. "Mr. Ellis," she whispered. He turned, surprised. "I'm sorry if I woke you, the fire was getting low." "It's all right." Rose shifted, wincing slightly as the baby gave a particularly strong kick. Preston noticed immediately. "Are you in pain?" "No, just uncomfortable. The baby is very active tonight." He nodded, returning to his pallet. "That's good. Active babies are healthy babies." The simple reassurance comforted her. "Mr. Ellis," she began hesitantly, "may I ask you something personal?" In the dim light, she saw him sit up. "Of course. Why did you really take me in that night?" The truth. For a long moment he was silent, and Rose thought perhaps he wouldn't answer. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "My mother was unmarried when she had me. Her family cast her out, much like yours did to you." The firelight cast shadows across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. "We struggled for years. She worked herself to the bone to provide for me, took abuse and judgment from respectable folks." There was bitterness in the way he said respectable. "She died when I was 15, worn out before her time." Rose felt a lump form in her throat. "I'm sorry. When I saw you that night, pregnant and alone in the cold." He trailed off, then cleared his throat. "I couldn't turn you away, not when I knew what that meant." "Your kindness has saved us," Rose said softly, her hand resting on her belly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you. There's nothing to repay." His voice was firm. "You've more than earned your keep with your work. The books haven't been this organized since. Well, ever." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the persistent howl of the wind outside. "Mr. Ellis," Rose said after a while, "I think, given our circumstances, you might call me Rose." Even in the dim light, she could see his smile. "Then I'm Preston. Now try to get some rest. Rose." The way he said her name, with a gentle warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, stirred something within her that she hadn't felt in a long time, something she had no right to feel, given her situation. Troubled by these unexpected emotions, Rose turned toward the wall, willing herself back to sleep. The storm raged for 3 days, forcing Preston to remain in the cabin. What could have been an awkward confinement instead became a time of deepening connection. During the long hours of enforced proximity, they shared stories of their pasts. Preston spoke of his time at medical school, cut short by the war, and the horrors he'd witnessed as a young soldier that had left him unable to continue his studies afterward. Rose told him about growing up as the preacher's daughter, always expected to be a model of propriety and virtue. She spoke of her love of books and learning, and her thwarted dreams of becoming a teacher. "What about the baby's father?" Preston asked on the third evening, then immediately raised his hands. "Forgive me, that's not my business." "No, it's a fair question." Rose sighed, her hands folded protectively over her belly. "His name was James. He came through Independence with a cattle drive last winter. He was charming, attentive, and full of promises." Her voice hardened. He spoke of marriage, of a home in California. I believed him. By the time I discovered I was with child, he was long gone. Preston's expression darkened. Men like that deserve, he cut himself off. I'm sorry you were deceived. I was foolish, Rose said quietly. My father made that quite clear. You were trusting, Preston countered. There's a difference. Outside, the wind had finally begun to ease, signaling the storm's passing. Tomorrow, Preston would return to his quarters above the stable, and their brief interlude of intimacy would end. Rose was surprised to find herself regretting this, even as she knew it was proper and necessary. I should check on the horses at first light, Preston said, rising to add another log to the fire. They'll be restless after being cooped up for days. Of course. Rose hesitated, then asked, Will Ember's foal come soon? Preston nodded, a smile warming his features. Any day now. It'll be her first. I'm a bit concerned she's small for her breed. Is there anything I can do to help? Just keep brewing that raspberry leaf tea you've been making. It's good for the mares before birthing, just like it is for women. Rose blushed slightly at his matter-of-fact mention of her own preparations for childbirth. Over the past weeks, she'd been gathering herbs and supplies, guided by a midwifery book Preston had quietly acquired during one of his trips to Kansas City. I'll make extra tomorrow, she promised. The storm's passing brought a new clarity to the winter landscape, pristine, snow blanketing the fields, sunshine sparkling on ice-laden tree branches. It also marked a subtle shift in Rose and Preston's relationship. Though he returned to sleeping in the stable quarters, he spent more evenings in the cabin, often reading aloud from one of his books while Rose sewed baby clothes from fabric he'd brought back from town. December arrived, bringing Rose's confinement into its final weeks. Her body felt increasingly unwieldy, sleep more elusive. Preston, noticing her discomfort, fashioned additional pillows and a footstool to ease her strain. His attentiveness both touched and troubled her. She was growing far too accustomed to his presence, to his quiet strength and unexpected gentleness. One crisp afternoon, as Rose was updating the breeding records at the small desk by the window, she heard urgent footsteps approaching the cabin. Preston burst through the door, his expression alight with excitement. Ember's time has come, he announced. Would you like to see? It might be educational. Rose hesitated only briefly before nodding. Yes, I think that would be wise. In the warmth of the foaling stable, Rose watched in fascination as Preston guided the mare through her labor with calm efficiency. His hands were steady, his voice soothing as he murmured encouragement to the straining animal. When the foal finally emerged, a leggy filly with her mother's rich sorrel coloring, Rose found tears streaming down her face at the miracle of new life. She's beautiful, she whispered, watching the wobbly newborn struggle to stand for the first time. Preston looked up, his face transformed by a rare, unguarded smile. She is, isn't she? His eyes met Rose's over the back of the exhausted mare. You did well, staying calm through it all. Most people find birthing messy and frightening. It was both those things, Rose admitted, but also wondrous. Yes, something in his gaze made her heart flutter strangely. Wondrous is exactly the word. That night, Rose dreamed of Preston's hands, gentle and sure as they had been with the mare, and woke with a flush of shame at the direction of her thoughts. She was an unmarried mother-to-be, dependent on his charity. Such feelings were inappropriate and dangerous. Yet as the days passed, she found it increasingly difficult to deny the growing warmth between them. Preston never overstepped the bounds of propriety, but she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that suggested he was battling similar conflicts. A week before Christmas, Preston returned from a supply run to Kansas City with more parcels than usual. Among the necessities were small luxuries. Rose hadn't requested peppermint candy, a length of soft flannel in a pretty shade of blue, a jar of preserved peaches that must have cost a small fortune in winter. You shouldn't spend your money on such things for me, she protested when he unloaded these items. Preston shrugged, not meeting her eyes. Christmas is coming, and you've worked hard these past months. You've earned a few comforts. That evening, as they sat by the fire enjoying the rare treat of peaches, Preston cleared his throat nervously. Rose, there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you. She looked up, alarmed by his serious tone. Is something wrong? No, not at all. He set aside his empty bowl. It's about after the baby comes. I know we agreed you would stay until the birth, but winter's no time to be traveling with a newborn. I'd like you to stay on, indefinitely." Rose stared at him, uncertain she had heard correctly. "Indefinitely, at least through the spring," he amended quickly. "Or longer if you wish. The arrangement has worked well, hasn't it? Your organizational skills have been invaluable to the business." "Yes, but—" Rose searched for the right words. "People will talk, Preston, a single woman living on a man's property with a child." "People always talk," he said dismissively. "I've never much cared what others think." "Well, I do care," Rose replied, more sharply than she intended. "I've already been cast out once for ruining my reputation. I won't bring scandal to your doorstep as well." Preston leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Rose, listen to me. You haven't ruined anything. You made a mistake, yes, but you're facing its consequences with more courage and dignity than most people show in a lifetime." His words struck her deeply, not because they were what she wanted to hear, but because they reflected exactly what she needed to believe about herself. Her eyes filled with tears she couldn't control. "Oh, Rose," concern flooded his face. "I didn't mean to upset you." "It's not that," she managed, wiping her eyes. "It's just, no one has spoken to me with such respect since before." Preston moved from his chair to kneel beside hers, though he was careful not to touch her. "Then they're fools, the lot of them. You belong here, Rose, you and your child. This can be your home for as long as you want it. You belong." Those words, spoken with such conviction, broke something loose inside her, a longing for acceptance she'd been carrying since long before her father had slammed the door in her face. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to say more past the lump in her throat. Preston nodded, seemingly understanding all she couldn't express. He returned to his chair, allowing her the space to compose herself. Later, as he prepared to leave for his quarters, he paused at the door. "Think about it, Rose. No need to decide tonight." His smile was gentle. "Merry Christmas." After he'd gone, Rose sat for a long time by the fire, her hand resting on her belly as the baby shifted restlessly within. She thought of Preston, his kindness, his quiet strength, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She thought of how he'd never once made her feel like a burden or a charity case, but rather a valued partner in his work. And she allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a future here, raising her child in this peaceful place with Preston Ellis as a permanent part of their lives. The vision was so achingly sweet that it frightened her. Rose shook her head, banishing the foolish daydream. She would stay through the winter, yes, practicality demanded it. But come spring, she would need to find her own way. Depending too much on Preston's generosity was dangerous, not just for her reputation, but for her heart. Christmas arrived with a fresh blanket of snow and a crisp, cloudless sky. Rose woke early to prepare a special breakfast, determined to make the day festive despite their modest circumstances. She had used some of her small wages to secretly purchase a new pocket knife for Preston, noticing his old one was worn and dull. When he arrived at the cabin, stamping snow from his boots, he carried a small, wrapped package. "Merry Christmas," he said, seeming almost shy as he handed it to her. Inside was a beautiful wooden rattle, hand-carved with delicate patterns of leaves and vines. "Preston," Rose breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Did you make this?" He nodded, color rising in his cheeks. "I'm not much of a craftsman, but I thought the baby should have something special." "It's perfect," Rose said, meaning it. She handed him her own gift, watching as pleasure lit his features upon opening it. "How did you know I needed this?" he asked, testing the blade's edge with his thumb. "I pay attention," she replied simply. They shared a quiet Christmas dinner, and afterward Preston surprised her by producing a fiddle from behind the woodbox. "You play?" Rose asked, delighted. "Poorly," he admitted with a grin, "but well enough for a Christmas tune or two." The sound of Silent Night filled the small cabin, slightly off-key but heartfelt. Rose found herself singing along, her voice blending with the fiddle's wavering notes. In that moment, with firelight dancing on the walls and music in the air, she felt a happiness she'd thought was forever lost to her. As December gave way to January, winter tightened its grip on the prairie. Heavy snows kept Preston busy ensuring the animals were fed and watered, the paths between buildings kept clear. Rose's time was increasingly consumed with preparations for the baby's arrival, now just weeks away. One bitterly cold evening, as winds rattled the cabin windows, Rose felt the first strange tightening across her belly. She dismissed it initially; it was too soon. Surely, but when the sensation returned with increasing frequency, she could no longer deny what was happening. "Preston," she called when he came in for their evening meal, her voice steadier than she felt. "I think it's beginning." His head snapped up, eyes widening momentarily before his expression settled into calm determination. "How far apart are the pains?" "About 20 minutes, I think." Rose pressed a hand to her lower back, where a dull ache had been building all afternoon. "It's too early; the baby isn't due for another 3 weeks. First babies often come early," Preston said, setting aside his coat and moving to stoke the fire. "And they usually take their time about it. We may have a long night ahead." His matter-of-fact approach helped calm Rose's rising panic. This was happening, ready or not. Thank God she wasn't facing it alone. The labor progressed slowly through the night. Preston heated water, prepared clean linens, and arranged the bed for delivery with the efficiency of his medical training. Between contractions, he kept Rose walking slowly around the cabin, supporting her when the pains came, offering sips of water and words of encouragement. As dawn approached, the contractions intensified, coming faster and harder. Rose clung to Preston's hands, no longer caring about modesty or propriety. Pain stripped away such concerns, leaving only the primal struggle of bringing new life into the world. "You're doing beautifully," Preston murmured as she panted through a particularly vicious contraction. "The baby will be here soon." "I can't," Rose gasped, exhaustion overwhelming her. "Preston, I can't do this." "Yes, you can," he said firmly, his eyes holding hers. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Rose Grayson. Now when the next pain comes, I need you to push." Somehow, his belief in her gave Rose the strength to continue. With the next contraction, she bore down with all her remaining energy, a cry tearing from her throat. "I can see the head," Preston reported, his voice steady despite the extraordinary situation. "One more good push, Rose." The final moments passed in a blur of pain and effort, and then, suddenly, a new sound filled the cabin, the indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. "A boy," Preston announced, his voice thick with emotion. "You have a son, Rose." He placed the squalling infant on Rose's chest, and the world seemed to stop as she gazed down at her child for the first time. Tiny fists waved in protest at this cold, bright world, a shock of dark hair plastered to his perfectly formed head. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I've waited so long to meet you." Preston moved efficiently around them, completing the necessary post-birth tasks with quiet competence. When everything was settled, he brought a basin of warm water and helped Rose clean the baby, then swaddled him in the soft flannel he'd brought from Kansas City. "He's perfect," Preston said softly, watching as the newborn rooted against Rose's breast, instinctively seeking nourishment. "Have you thought of a name?" Rose looked down at her son, overwhelmed by the fierce love surging through her exhausted body. "William," she decided, "after my grandfather." "William Preston Grayson." Preston's head jerked up, surprise evident in his features. "Preston, if you don't mind," Rose said, suddenly uncertain. "Without you, we might not have survived. I want him to carry something of your kindness with him." "I'm honored," Preston replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I can say." In the quiet that followed, as dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape and young William nursed contentedly, Rose felt a profound shift in her universe. Whatever happened next, her life had been irrevocably changed not just by motherhood, but by the man who had given her shelter when the rest of the world turned its back. The first weeks of William's life passed in a haze of exhaustion and wonder. Preston proved an unexpectedly helpful presence, bringing meals, stoking the fire through the night, and even walking the colicky infant when Rose was at the end of her endurance. His medical knowledge was invaluable, easing her fears when William developed a mild rash, assuring her that his frequent feeding was normal and healthy. January gave way to February, and slowly, a new routine emerged. As Rose regained her strength, she began to take on light household tasks again. With William sleeping in a cradle Preston had fashioned from an old apple barrel. The baby thrived despite his early arrival, his tiny features gradually taking on more distinction. Rose's mouth, but darker coloring that must have come from his absent father. One evening, as they sat before the fire Rose nursing William, while Preston read aloud from a volume of Thoreau, a sudden pounding at the door startled them both. Preston was on his feet instantly, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle kept by the door. "Stay here," he murmured to Rose, who had clutched William protectively to her chest. When he opened the door, a blast of winter air swept in, along with the town's deputy, Malcolm Hedges. The lawman stamped snow from his boots, his gaze moving curiously between Preston and Rose. "Evening, Ellis," he said, removing his hat. "Sorry to disturb you, but we've got trouble brewing. Gang of outlaws hit the bank over in Pleasant Hill yesterday. Word is they're headed this way, probably aiming to hole up in the abandoned Wilkins place about 5 miles north of here." Preston's expression darkened. How many? 5, maybe 6, armed and desperate. The deputy's eyes drifted to Rose and the baby. "Madam." Rose nodded stiffly, aware of how the scene must look to an outsider herself with a newborn, obviously living in Preston's cabin. The deputy's carefully neutral expression couldn't quite hide his curiosity. "Sheriff's gathering a posse," Hedges continued. "Thought you should know, being out here isolated like you are, might want to keep that rifle handy till we run him down." "Appreciate the warning," Preston said. "I'll keep watch." After the deputy had gone, an uneasy silence fell between them. Rose finally broke it, her voice tight. "He'll tell everyone in Independence about us." Preston shrugged, returning to his chair. "Let him, we've done nothing wrong, haven't we?" Rose asked softly, adjusting William against her shoulder. "A man and woman living together, unmarried with a newborn child, the whole town will believe William is yours. Would that be so terrible?" The question was gentle, but it hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Rose stared at him, her heart suddenly pounding. "What are you saying, Preston?" He took a deep breath, setting aside his book. "I'm saying that perhaps we should give them something true to talk about instead of their assumptions and gossip. I don't understand." Preston moved to kneel beside her chair, his eyes serious in the firelight. "Rose, these past months have been the happiest of my life. You and William, you've brought something to this place I didn't even know was missing." Rose felt tears pricking at her eyes. "Preston, don't, please." "I'm not in a position to marry me," he interrupted, his voice low but firm. "Be my wife. Let me be a father to William." "You don't have to do this," Rose whispered, even as her heart leapt treacherously at his words. "I never expected. This isn't about expectation or obligation." Preston took her free hand in his. "It's about love, Rose. I love you. I think I have since that first night when you stood in my yard with nothing but courage and determination keeping you on your feet." A tear slipped down Rose's cheek. "You can't mean that. You deserve a wife without my complications, a woman who can give you children of your own." "I don't want any woman, I want you." His thumb gently wiped away her tear. "And William is already as dear to me as if he were my own flesh and blood. I don't care what anyone in town thinks or says. I care about us, our family." "Our family?" The words echoed in Rose's heart, stirring a longing so profound it nearly took her breath away. She looked down at William, peaceful in her arms, then back at the man kneeling before her, the man who had shown her nothing but kindness, respect, and now, incredibly, love. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, I'll marry you, Preston." Joy blazed across his features. Slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in their first kiss, gentle, reverent, and full of promise. When they parted, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I'll ride into Kansas City tomorrow for the license. We can be married by the circuit judge when he comes through next week." Rose nodded, a mixture of happiness and lingering uncertainty swirling within her. "Are you sure about this?" "Truly sure. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." His smile was tender as he gazed at her and William. "You belong here, Rose, both of you. This is your home." There it was again, "you belong," the words that had touched her so deeply months ago. Only now they carried the weight of love behind them, transforming them from an offer of shelter to a promise of forever. That night, after Preston had returned to his quarters and William had finally settled into sleep, Rose stood at the cabin window, looking out at the star-filled winter sky. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she allowed herself to believe in a future filled with joy rather than struggle, a future with Preston by her side, raising William together in this peaceful place they would call home. The week leading up to the wedding was filled with quiet preparations. Preston returned from Kansas City with not only the marriage license, but also a simple gold band and a blue calico dress for Rose to wear for the ceremony. He'd also brought candy for the baby, though William, at barely a month old, was far too young for such treats. "For when he's older," Preston said with a grin when Rose pointed this out. The outlaw gang the deputy had warned them about was captured by the sheriff's posse before they could cause trouble, easing one worry from their minds. But the prospect of facing Independence's judgment still loomed, especially for Rose. "We could go elsewhere after the wedding," Preston suggested as they discussed the future. "Start fresh where no one knows us." Rose considered this, watching as Preston gently rocked William's cradle with his foot while they talked. The sight of this strong man so tender with her child never failed to move her. "No," she decided finally. "This is your home, your livelihood. You've built something special here. I won't ask you to abandon it because I'm afraid of wagging tongues." Preston's eyes filled with admiration. "We'll face them together, then." The circuit judge, a practical man with little patience for social niceties, performed their wedding in the cabin on a bright February morning. The only witnesses were William, sleeping peacefully in his cradle, and the judge's clerk, a young man who seemed more interested in the promise of a hot meal than the ceremony itself. Rose wore the blue calico dress, her hair arranged simply but becomingly. Preston had shaved carefully and donned his best shirt, his usual confidence tempered by a touching nervousness as he repeated his vows. "I, Preston James Ellis, take thee, Rose Elizabeth Grayson, to be my lawfully wedded wife." His voice was steady, his eyes never leaving hers as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her until death parted them. When Rose's turn came, emotion nearly overwhelmed her, but she managed to speak her vows clearly, meaning every word with all her heart. The gold band slid onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had always belonged there. "By the authority vested in me by the state of Missouri, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the judge declared. "You may kiss the bride." Preston's kiss was gentle but heartfelt, his hands cradling her face as if she were something infinitely precious. When they parted, his smile held such joy that Rose felt tears threatening again. "Mrs. Ellis," he whispered, the wonder in his voice making her heart soar. Later, after the judge and his clerk had departed with bellies full of Rose's cooking, husband and wife stood together by William's cradle, watching their son sleep. "He looks peaceful," Preston observed, his arm around Rose's waist. "He is," Rose agreed. "He knows he's safe and loved." "As he always will be." Preston turned to face her, his expression serious. "Rose, I want you to know I'll never try to take James's place in William's life. When he's old enough to understand, we'll tell him the truth about his father." Rose nodded, touched by his thoughtfulness. "And what will we tell him about you?" "That I chose to be his father," Preston said simply. "That I loved him from the moment I saw him, just as I loved his mother." Rose leaned into his embrace, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her from despair to this moment of perfect happiness. "I love you, Preston Ellis. And I love you, Rose Ellis," he smiled against her hair. "More than I ever thought possible." That evening, with William fed and sleeping soundly, husband and wife retired to the bed they would now share. There was awkwardness, initially both nervous, despite their deep feelings for each other. But Preston's gentle patience and Rose's growing trust in him soon gave way to a passionate connection that surprised and delighted them both. Afterward, lying in his arms as moonlight spilled through the cabin window, Rose marveled at how completely her life had transformed in the span of a few short months. From homeless and desperate to wife and mother, cherished and secure. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I never expected to be this happy again," she admitted. "After everything that happened, I thought that part of my life was over. And now," Rose smiled up at him, "now I believe in second chances." Spring arrived early that year, the March sunshine melting the last of winter's snow and coaxing green shoots from the awakening earth. William, now 3 months old, had grown into a sturdy, alert infant with his mother's expressive eyes and an increasingly familiar smile. Preston had expanded the cabin during the mild weather, adding a proper bedroom for themselves and a smaller one for William. His business continued to thrive, with Rose managing the books and correspondence with increasing confidence while caring for their son. They had ventured into independence together only once since their marriage to purchase supplies they couldn't get elsewhere. The experience had been uncomfortable but not as terrible as Rose had feared. There were whispers and stares, certainly, but Preston's protective presence and obvious devotion made it clear to everyone that this was a real marriage, not a marriage of convenience or scandal. Reverend Grayson had pointedly avoided them, crossing to the other side of the street when he spotted his daughter. The rejection still stung, but Rose found it didn't devastate her as it once would have. Her father's approval no longer defined her worth. On a particularly beautiful April afternoon, Rose sat on a blanket spread in the grass near the paddock, watching as Preston worked with a young colt. William lay beside her, kicking his legs and cooing at the clouds drifting overhead. "Look at your papa," Rose told him softly, though he was far too young to understand. "Isn't he handsome?" As if hearing her words, Preston looked up and grinned, waving before returning to his work. The sight of him strong, capable, and so undeniably her still had the power to make Rose's heart skip a beat. A movement at the edge of the property caught her attention. A buggy was approaching down the long drive, its single occupant unfamiliar at this distance. Visitors were rare, especially unannounced ones. Rose gathered William into her arms and stood, suddenly wary. Preston had also noticed the arrival. He secured the colt in the paddock and strode toward Rose, his expression concerned. "Are you expecting anyone?" She shook her head. "No." "Perhaps it's a potential client for you?" They watched together as the buggy drew closer, finally revealing its driver, a woman in a plain dark dress, her face partially obscured by a bonnet. When she pulled the horse to a stop and looked up, Rose gasped in recognition. "Mother." Elizabeth Grayson's hands trembled slightly as she gathered her reticule. "Rose," she acknowledged, her voice carrying a mixture of uncertainty and determination. Her eyes moved to the baby in Rose's arms, then to Preston standing protectively beside them. "Mrs. Grayson," Preston said, stepping forward to assist her from the buggy. "This is unexpected." "Yes, Elizabeth hesitated, seeming to struggle for words. "Your father doesn't know I'm here," she finally said to Rose. "He wouldn't approve." Rose swallowed hard, emotions warring within her. Her mother had never defied her father in all the years of their marriage. This visit represented an act of rebellion that Rose could scarcely comprehend. "Would you like to come inside?" she offered, finding her voice at last. "It's nearly time for tea." In the cabin, an awkward silence prevailed as Elizabeth perched on the edge of a chair, her gaze repeatedly drawn to William. Rose prepared tea, her hands shaking slightly, while Preston excused himself to tend to the horses, tactfully giving mother and daughter privacy. "He's beautiful," Elizabeth finally said, nodding toward William, who was now sleeping in his cradle. "May I?" "Of course." Rose watched as her mother approached the cradle, peering down at the sleeping infant with an expression of wonder. "He looks like you did," Elizabeth murmured. "The same little chin." Rose set the tea tray on the table. "Why are you here, Mother, after all this time?" Elizabeth straightened, composing herself. "I couldn't stop thinking about you, especially after I heard you'd married." She glanced around the cabin, noting the signs of a happy home. Preston's books mingled with Rose's on the shelves, wildflowers in a jar on the table, the rocking chair where Rose nursed William. "You seem, well, I am well," Rose confirmed. "Better than well, I'm happy, Mother, truly happy." "Your husband, he's good to you, and the baby." "Preston is the finest man I've ever known," Rose said without hesitation. "He loves William as his own. We're blessed to have him." Elizabeth nodded, tears suddenly brimming in her eyes. "I should have come sooner. I should have stood up to your father when he sent you away. I've been a coward, Rose, and I'm so very sorry for it." Rose felt her own eyes fill with tears. "You were always subject to his will, just as I was. That's no excuse." Elizabeth reached for Rose's hand. "I'm your mother. I should have protected you when you needed me most." The simple acknowledgement of this failure was more healing than Rose could have imagined. She squeezed her mother's hand. "You're here now?" "Yes." Elizabeth took a deep breath. "And I'd like to be part of your life, yours and William's, if you'll allow it. I can't promise your father will ever come around. His pride and his position in the community mean too much to him. But I miss my daughter." Rose studied her mother's face, seeing the sincerity there along with a new strength she'd never noticed before. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. "William should know his grandmother." Relief flooded Elizabeth's features. "Thank you, Rose." When Preston returned to the cabin an hour later, he found mother and daughter seated close together on the settle, Elizabeth holding William while Rose showed her the baby clothes she'd made. The scene gave him pause. This tentative reconciliation was clearly fragile, but important. "Mr. Ellis," Elizabeth greeted him, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "I hope you don't mind my intrusion." "Not at all, Mrs. Grayson. Your family—" His words were simple but sincere. "And please call me Preston." Something in his straightforward acceptance seemed to reassure Elizabeth. "I should be getting back before dark," she said reluctantly, handing William back to Rose. "But perhaps I might visit again next week." "We'd like that," Rose answered, looking to Preston for confirmation. He nodded, smiling. As they walked Elizabeth back to her buggy, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard, Rose felt a sense of completion she hadn't known she was missing. Her mother's visit, while unexpected, had closed a painful chapter and opened the possibility of a new relationship, one based on choice rather than obligation. "Will you be all right?" Preston asked quietly after they'd waved Elizabeth off. "That must have been difficult." Rose leaned against him, William sleeping peacefully in her arms. "It was, but in a good way, a healing way." She looked up at her husband, struck again by the depth of her love for him. "Thank you for giving her a chance." "Everyone deserves a second chance," Preston said, echoing Rose's own words from months earlier. "Besides, William should know his grandmother." He brushed a kiss against her forehead. "And I'd like her to know that her daughter is cherished exactly as she deserves to be." The year that followed brought changes both expected and surprising. William grew from infant to toddler, taking his first steps across the cabin floor toward Preston's outstretched arms, speaking his first word "Papa" to Rose's delight and Preston's undisguised pride. Elizabeth Grayson became a regular visitor, coming every other Sunday for dinner, bringing small gifts for William and gradually rebuilding her relationship with her daughter. Reverend Grayson remained unyielding in his position, but Rose found that his rejection no longer had the power to wound her as it once had. Preston's horse breeding business expanded, gaining renown throughout the region for the quality of his stock. Rose's organizational skills proved invaluable as the operation grew, and they hired 2 young men from town to help with the increasing workload. In the summer, they traveled to Kansas City for a proper honeymoon, leaving William in Elizabeth's care for 3 blissful days of privacy and reconnection. Upon their return, Rose discovered she was expecting their second child, Preston's biological child, though he insisted William would always be equally his son. "A brother or sister for our boy," he said, his hand resting reverently on Rose's still flat stomach. What a blessing. As Rose's pregnancy progressed, she often found herself reflecting on how differently she felt this time, surrounded by love and support, anticipating the birth with joy rather than fear. Preston was attentive without being overbearing, making sure she rested when needed while encouraging her to remain active and engaged in their shared work. William, now nearly 2, seemed to sense the coming change, often patting Rose's growing belly and declaring "baby" with solemn importance. Preston had built him a proper bed to replace his outgrown cradle, explaining that the new baby would need it soon. In late April, as the prairie bloomed with wildflowers and new life stirred everywhere on their thriving farm, Rose went into labor. Unlike William's birth, which had been fraught with uncertainty and exhaustion, this delivery progressed smoothly and relatively quickly. Elizabeth was present this time, having arrived for her regular Sunday visit just as the pains began in earnest. With both her mother and Preston attending her, Rose brought their daughter into the world just after midnight, a robust infant with a shock of dark hair like her father's and a determined cry that made them all laugh. "What shall we name her?" Preston asked, cradling the newborn with practiced ease while Elizabeth helped Rose settle more comfortably. Rose smiled, watching her husband's face as he gazed adoringly at their daughter. "Hope," she decided. "Hope Elizabeth Ellis." "Perfect," Preston agreed, tears shining in his eyes. "Absolutely perfect." William, who had slept through the birth in his little bed behind a screen, was introduced to his sister the next morning. He approached cautiously, his expression serious as he studied the swaddled bundle in his mother's arms. "Baby," he stated, reaching out a tentative finger to touch her tiny hand. When Hope reflexively grasped his finger, William's face broke into a delighted grin. "My baby." "Yes, your sister," Rose confirmed, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain such happiness. "You'll help us take care of her, won't you?" William nodded solemnly, his brown eyes so like Rose's own wide with the importance of this responsibility. Preston lifted him onto the bed beside Rose, careful not to disturb her or the baby. "Our family," Preston said softly, his arm encircling them all. "Complete." Rose leaned against her husband's shoulder, gazing at their children, one born of her body but claimed by Preston's heart, the other a perfect blend of them both. "Yes," she agreed, "complete and perfect." 5 years later, on a golden autumn afternoon much like the one when Rose had first staggered onto Preston's property, the Ellis family gathered in the yard to celebrate William's 7th birthday. The farm had prospered beyond their expectations, with a larger house now standing beside the original cabin, which had been converted to an office for their growing business. William, tall for his age and possessing his mother's quiet intelligence, supervised his little sister Hope and 3-year-old brother James as they played a game involving much running and laughter. Elizabeth Grayson sat in a chair under the great oak tree, smiling as she watched her grandchildren. Preston came to stand beside Rose, slipping an arm around her waist as they observed the scene. "Happy?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "Completely," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Do you ever think about that night? When I arrived here with nothing but the clothes on my back and a baby on the way?" "Often," Preston admitted. "I thank God every day that you found your way here." Rose turned in his arms to face him, still struck by the love shining in his eyes after all these years. "You saved us, you know." "Me and William?" "No," Preston corrected gently. "We saved each other." He brushed a kiss against her forehead. "You gave me a family, Rose, a purpose beyond work. You taught me what it means to truly belong somewhere with someone." "Mama, Papa," William called, interrupting the moment. "Come see what we made." Hand in hand, they crossed the yard to where their children waited, eager to show off some new discovery. As Rose watched Preston kneel to admire whatever treasure the children had found, his patience and delight evident in every line of his body, she silently thanked the desperate courage that had driven her forward on that long-ago night. The journey from banishment to belonging had been arduous, marked by pain and uncertainty. But it had led her here to this man, these children, this life filled with love and purpose. To a place where you belong wasn't just a kindness offered to a desperate stranger, but a promise kept through all the seasons of their shared lives. A promise that had become her most cherished truth. Here in this home they had built together, Rose truly belonged.